How we doing, folks? My guest today is going to be Ezra Callahan. Ezra was one of the first employees at Facebook. He ended up spending over 6 years with the company and was the company's first product manager. Throughout his years at Facebook, he ended up being a jack of all trades and being in all aspects of the business while the company grew exponentially. He learned leaps and bounds there and decided to try his hand in the field of entrepreneurship. He ended up being a co-founder and the chief investment officer at Arrive Hotels and Restaurants. And in this episode, we go through and talk to Ezra about the challenges of entrepreneurship, all that he learned so far throughout his career in business and his time at Facebook. I hope you folks enjoy this episode. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, on Ezra's behalf, In the Arena is donating $250 to the Mama to Mama Foundation, which shows mamas they're not alone by providing locally sourced care kits for new mamas around the world and reminds them they are loved, they have what they need, and there's a global community of mothers who have their back. To find out more about the Mama to Mama Foundation, please check out mamatomama.org. Thanks. You'll hear the buzzer here. Awesome. Ezra, thank you so much for taking the time. I really do appreciate you having in. We had a few different things we kind of had to work through, a couple power outages here and there, but we're finally getting to make this chat happen. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So, one of the things that I really kind of wanted to start off with, because I listened to a few of your different discussions and things like that you've had and your talks. And one of the things that really kind of stuck out to me, or I thought was really interesting, is you're kind of navigating your early days at Facebook. And you just have, one of the things that struck me when you're talking about is you just have so many different hats. And I guess it's such an early on in that company, it's growing, the growth rate is so incredible and you're trying to keep up with it. And that's really one of those things I was just curious, that at least touched me when I was kind of going through and doing some research for this, like how, just speak to juggling those different aspects of the business and it being such a small company. I mean, you were the 6th employee there. And just kind of touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of always been one of those people who's, not an expert in anything, but knows a little about everything. I was very into trivia as a kid and just wanted to know lots and lots of facts. Like I remember I'd always get in trouble at school because on free reading, I would always choose nonfiction. Like I was the kid that read, the Guinness Book of World Records cover to cover and could rattle off, who had the longest fingernails of all time kind of thing. And that continued for me into college where I majored in a program, couldn't figure out what I wanted to major in and found a program at Stanford called Symbolic Systems, which was sort of a mixture of cognitive science and computer science, but required me to take philosophy, psychology, linguistics, coding classes, and just kind of all over. Mm-hmm. And so, those early days at Facebook, sort of played to my strength of a little bit of everything needed to be done. And, in those startup environments, you have to have this attitude of there is no job that's not my job because anything that you don't do isn't going to get done. And with where the company was, and it was something that followed me throughout my career at Facebook of, I bounced around wherever I felt like I could be most useful, again, because there were always people with more expertise. There were always people smarter than me or better at me than something. And I just found that my best fit was kind of being in the middle of it all. First within the product and engineering teams, eventually they landed on the role I was product manager. So I was the first product manager after being there for 6 months with no title. But even within that, I did work on some projects where I would be in charge of that project. But pretty quickly, my role became coordinating between teams and being the one making sure that everyone knew what was going on, which required me to be aware of what everyone was doing and what was everything going on. And eventually for me, that evolved into a role where I started the company's internal communications team, where it was, I created a role where now it's about helping the entire company keep track of what is everyone around the company doing as the organization grew. So it's interesting in those environments because you need the experts, you need the people who are very good at what it is you're doing. In Facebook's case, you needed the expert coders, the expert infrastructure guys, given how fast Facebook was growing. Just keeping the site online was probably its greatest engineering feat. And you need those sort of subject area experts, and they need that balance of those who can then be super flexible and take care of the rest. And that combination, and all of the businesses I've been involved with, when you get both of those elements together, is when I found businesses to be the most successful.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds like, it's a unique skill set, especially for you to know at least a little bit. And I'm sure you had to learn just a massive amount in that short period of time. But yeah, it really seems that would be super valuable to kind of, the humility you kind of talk about, and, I'm not the smartest here or there, but at least I have a knowledge base in every kind of area and can kind of guide the companies. And one of the things I remember listening you talk about was just your longevity, which I thought was very interesting. And I thought it was, especially in today's world, it's like, all right, I'm not happy with this job, or I'm not happy with this place. I'm here for 3 months. I'm moving on. I'm not happy now. I'm moving on to the next thing. And I feel like that's really, especially with the younger generations, kind of moving on to the next thing rather than kind of, sticking through and actually getting some of that longevity and getting that real experience when, you kind of have to persevere. You have to work through some different issues and problems rather than just kind of jumping ship.
My mind is blown. There's a handful of people who are sort of joined not that long after me. This one woman, Naomi Gleit, who I helped bring on about 6 months after I started, who's still at the company. And, I'm in awe of the people who have that level of stamina, and my parents are the definition of that, my dad finally retired last year after 50 years working for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, part of NASA here in Pasadena. My mom directed a preschool for 35 years before she retired a few years ago. My entire life, my parents had one job each, lived in the same house, have never moved, everything.
Yeah, right.
Everything. I think my dad's had the same thing for lunch for, going on 60 years now. So for me, it's funny on the one hand, compared to a lot of the people I started with at Facebook, I stuck it out for about 6 years. That felt like an eternity there. Mm-hmm. But in comparison to, my parents and some of those around me, it proved to be a run on the shorter side. Startup environments are very grueling, and Facebook was in particular, because it wasn't just a job, it was your life. And credit to Mark Zuckerberg, for all the criticisms one can lobby at him, one of the things he got right very early on was a focus on company culture, and this idea that he realized his work was his life and he wanted those around him to feel the same. And so he built really a community of like-minded people there. Mm-hmm. Almost everyone was straight out of college or in college, dropping out. We had a problem for a while of the people with family, the few older employees we had with families often felt marginalized and left out, given that, most decision-making was happening at, midnight around, a bunch of fast food wrappers or whoever brought in pizza super late or something, and they couldn't participate in that. But there was really no distinction between personal life and work life. We all lived together, we all hung out together, we'd party together, people dated. My wife and I met there, and neither of us was the first person we dated at the company. I think there's at least 20, maybe 30 odd couples who are married, who created families together out of those first early years, just because, it was almost an extension for college. Mm-hmm. And when people ask me what were those early days like, I tell them, for those of you who went to college, imagine if your freshman dorm ran a company. And that is exactly what the first 2 years of Facebook felt like, mostly because it was, we basically just recruited our friends straight out of school, and almost everyone who started knew someone who was already working there and just was absorbed right in. So it was extremely fun and a great experience. But after 6 years of it, it was, if you needed an identity that was not work, there was sort of only one way to forge that. And you sort of had to break free and go down a new path.
But I mean, and for you, I mean, how much did that help in moving forward into kind of some of your other businesses like Arrive and stuff like that kind of culture? Because I mean, it's not, you touched on with Mark that was one thing that really creating and kind of building that community. I feel like sometimes that seems like it could get lost in the fray. It's one of those simple things when I've had other coaches on or athletes, or they always talk about that environment, right? That culture that you create kind of continues to cultivate winners, or continues to cultivate, hey, this is the goal, we got to get this thing done, this is when the deadline is, like, and everyone can kind of work and build in together towards that.
I mean, that was sort of Facebook's, it's one of the things that Facebook, for being a, multinational global company with, over 100,000 employees, something they still do incredibly well. The crude way of putting it is getting people to drink the Kool-Aid. The positive way of putting it is they get people aligned with their mission, and they get people to care about their work and to see how their work connects to the bigger picture. In the early days, it was achieved by being very open and inclusive. The company, if anything that was going on in the company, you could know and see and be a part of. Everything was debated, which is funny because Facebook is a very top-down company. Mark Zuckerberg controls the company thoroughly, absolutely. What he wants, he rarely gets dissuaded from what he set his mind to. And at the same time, the most notable characteristic of company culture in the early days was an openness that you could challenge him on anything. Interestingly, when I started the internal communications team, I one of the things that fell under me is I took over the company events. And so we'd have, company-wide all hands meetings about once a month just to update folks who are going on. And once a week, Mark would, every Friday afternoon, he would host these Q&As that I would essentially be the host of, like literally the guy with the microphone running around asking people questions. But before every Q&A, I would spend about a half hour with him, just peppering him with the questions of, this is, me being the guy with his ear on the street, here's the things that I think you're going to get asked about. And just making sure he was sort of knew some of those things, especially the topics that were not front and center. If the office was a buzz about, a change to the bus schedule and people were pissed off about that, Mark wouldn't know the first thing about it. So part of me was to prep him, like, someone's going to ask you about the bus schedule. Here's the controversy. But at the same time, he always told me if there was ever a lull in the questionings or people were just asking, bad questions, he was always like, your job is to ask me the hardest question you can think of. And it was, it was a pretty fraught responsibility there, because it's both trying to set an example of openness for the company, me being sort of a, very opinionated person within the company. There were plenty of things I'd want to challenge him on in front of everyone, but at the same time, trying to balance that with, one time you're going to ask the question wrong or ask the wrong, say the wrong thing, and you're just going to land yourself in a heap of trouble. And so walking that fine line of ask the hardest question, without abusing that privilege you were given. But that openness in the company really got people dedicated. And if people care about what they're doing, the output's going to be so much greater. Even overcoming talent deficits with just effort and dedication. And it was amazing how dedicated and fully sold on the mission of what Facebook was doing everyone was back in 2005, 2006, 2007. And you have to keep in mind, that's back when, the early parts of that are when Facebook is still a college-only site. It's not even open to the general public. And then the very early days of the company starting to grow outside of college. And the world is still extremely skeptical of everything we're doing. No one is convinced Facebook is here to stay. Everyone still thinks it's going to lose to MySpace, or all of social media is a fad. Nobody's convinced. Every time Facebook's taking these investments, I remember our first investment company got valued at $100 million. And it was like the laughing stock of the Silicon Valley for a month of who are these idiot VCs valuing this company at $100 million, who's made, Lord knows what they walked away with from that. And building that dedication. And interestingly, that's actually been the biggest challenge in all of my business ventures since, is how do you replicate that? Shifting into the world of hospitality, that is the greatest challenge in the world of hospitality, is how do you get people to care about what they're doing? And that is, in the world of restaurants, for example, that alone is almost what differentiates restaurants that succeed from restaurants that don't, is having a staff that cares is probably your greatest indicator. How sticky is your staff? How much are they paying attention to every little thing they're doing? One of the funny things I noticed in being in the tech world, everyone is being given incentive equity, even to this day. You get stock options, or, what restricted stock units they're now called, but basically you get stock in the company as part of your compensation to get you to stay and care, and in our early days, and still to this day at Facebook, they spend so much time and effort pushing company culture and getting people to care about their jobs and to understand the mission and feel aligned with the mission. And what's funny is that tech companies, it actually doesn't matter all that much. For Facebook having 100,000 employees today, 90% of the company's success is probably contingent on just a couple hundred of the most important employees, who are the smartest, sharpest, most talented at what they do, either product design, infrastructure engineering, communications. Tech companies really are largely dependent on just a few people, and the long tail of employees is there for support. But you don't really, it's not as critical to the company's success that all of those people be fully bought in and rooted in it, even though Facebook did an amazing job of getting those people that engaged. Shift over to our hotels, where the script is flipped, where we are most dependent on that long tail of employees, because they're the ones everyone's interacting with. Us clowns at the top could have all these great ideas for, this is the hotel brand, this is our language, this is the design, this is the image. At the end of the day, a guest experience has far more to do with, was the front desk person courteous? Did the housekeeper of the 6 rooms that housekeeper cleaned that day, did they get every detail right? Missing one thing in a room can ruin it. One Kleenex left from the previous guest in a bad spot, one dirty sink, anything can just ruin a guest experience. You're the most dependent on that long tail of employees, and they're the least well compensated, and they're never paid in any form of equity or any kind of profit sharing, and there's no incentive for them to care about what they're doing. A lot of times they're working at multiple companies. Half our wait staff at our restaurants have second jobs at other restaurants. So how are you going to command loyalty? Not just loyalty, but do they care about every interaction they're having, and can they internalize that? That's actually been one of the biggest challenges for me, is trying to figure out, how do you replicate this in environments where it's very, very critical that everyone feel aligned and included. We tried a bunch of stuff that we thought would work. We tried an incentive equity plan at our first hotel, and it just didn't resonate or land at all.
Interesting.
And we tried all these things to try to build company culture, and it proved everything that I thought had worked in the tech world, none of it worked in the brick and mortar world, in the world of hospitality. And I had to really relearn, what is it that keeps people motivated and aligned at those types of environments. And it was very, very different. So that theme has proven the same, of our successful hotels and restaurants very much have staff who are engaged, aligned, and bought into the mission. And the ones that have struggled, very much that has been a struggle, that cultural struggle has been there as well. And so learning what has worked at some places and seeing what works at others, and just how different it is from Silicon Valley, where the motivators there were so different.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I mean, it seems like part of that, at least, myself working in the hospitality industry and stuff, years at the brew pub, High West, everything else. I mean, part of that, those incentives that, there's a vision and there's a joy of workplace. Certainly, I mean, there was a lot of times when I was in the last few years of working at the brew pub, while I was still skiing and everything else. And then I was kind of done skiing and I was going back to school, finishing up my degree. And I still worked there like a couple of days a week, essentially just to go see the people there, because I had spent so much time there. They had moved up to manager role or whatever else. And it was like, it was started to become that culture of, about being about the people, and then wanting to create the right guest experience of, okay, you're not aware of Wasatch beers or High West whiskey. Like this is, it's really good product. And this is the reason why. So, I mean, it is one of those things that can be difficult, and it's gotta be a hard process to go through and vet those different, for me, it was pretty easy because I had, it was like, all right, working towards skiing, working towards these other things. And like, you have those other goals set in, where it's got to be difficult in the other process, where I would say some people might not be clearly as driven and trying to figure out what they really want to do. And it's got to be a really difficult process to vet through all those different people, because you got to have a lot of people applying.
Yeah. And figuring out the cause and effect of company culture is a really difficult thing. I remember twice while I was at Facebook, they brought in outside organizational consultants for some reason or other. And I remember one thing that was a lesson that I learned from both of them, or heard from both of them, talked about one of the most direct indicators of a healthy company culture in terms of being predictive of survey results around internal happiness and internal cohesion on a team, was the answer to the question of, do you have a best friend at work? And it turned out that question was more indicative of the overall happiness of the company than any other question, even ahead of, do you feel your compensation is fair and proper? Are you motivated by your boss? Are you aligned with the company vision? It turned out the leading indicator of happiness, or the most predictive question around employee happiness and employee stickiness more than anything, was, do you have a best friend at work? And it was really interesting your answer to that question is an interesting one, because it's not, almost no company explicitly says, our goal is to make sure you have a friend at work. Whereas, almost every other question the company would address, most companies know, how are we indexing pay against, standards for our industry? What are we trying to do around benefits? What are we trying to do around, education around our mission, products, et cetera? No company ever is like, let's make sure everyone's friends with each other, and sometimes you get team building stuff, but even then it's, friendship building isn't really the goal of those in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting to think about, clearly Facebook was successful and everyone at the company very much had a best friend, and then some, had lovers, spouses,
Right.
Groups of best friends, roommates, everything, but it really led to that question. And it was something interesting I saw at our hotels and restaurants too, of that was also sort of it showed up there of the restaurant units that were successful. It seemed like everyone there got along, the hotels that were most successful, the staff, would hang out outside of work together. And it really brought up the question, this chicken and egg question of, is it because they love their job that they're friends? Is it just dumb luck? We happen to get a group of people who like each other. Is it, what is it that is it something, is it the same thing that's causing people to be friends that's causing them to be happy, or, or what? And I honestly still have never figured it out. It does seem to be something you can't force. You can't just have icebreakers and happy hours at work all the time and just assume that's going to work. It takes something more than that, but I'm not sure what that more is exactly. Whoever figures it out is, going to be super successful, probably the best organizational consultant of all time, if they figure out what's that thing that gets people to, be friends and put down their guard. And it makes sense of that, back to that thing I was talking about earlier of having employees who are aligned and who care. It makes sense that if if you care, then you must care about your coworkers, which will lead to friendship? Or is it you care because you're friends with your coworkers and that's what sparks the care?
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it can go both ways.
Yeah.
But I think for any organization that's trying to assess what is our organizational health, it's a really good place to start, because, if something's going right and you have some ingredients or you're in the right direction, if you see those strong friendships among your employees and you certainly know something's wrong and you need to start investigating what's going on, if you find that none of your employees or very few of your employees
Mm-hmm.
Are connecting enough that they go past that sort of colleague phase to actually develop genuine friendships.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a difficult thing. And it seems like what you touched on is when you were starting out in Facebook, right? I mean, it's all friends, and then you're hiring friends, and then you're hiring and obviously the pool you're hiring from, they're talented, that they're hardworking, that they're smart, all those things. So, I mean, it really seems to be peas in a pod with that, when it's like, okay, I'm hiring my buddy, and also he's driven, hardworking,
Right.
talented, and he'll probably be pretty good at creating and growing the vision for sure. So that, I mean, it's definitely certainly a tricky thing, but I think that I wonder, maybe you do is it, incentive driven of like, hey, bring your you do a company wide, or you do a poll of like, all right, or like a referral, right? You do the $200 or whatever else.
It was even more. Facebook was, man, it's actually one of my favorite Facebook stories. I'm definitely a storyteller. I have lots of stories. One of my favorite Facebook stories was I brought one of my roommates, so Chris Cox, who today is the chief product officer at Facebook, basically number 3 or number 2 at the company, right by Mark Zuckerberg. One of those people I talked about, who he started in 2005 when we were living together. He was a grad student at Stanford at the time. We'd known each other undergrad, living together. I finally convinced him to drop out and come work at Facebook. And one of my main motivators was the company had this incredibly generous referral program at the time. And at the time, the incentive was you got either $5,000 or I forget what some number of shares. And I remember at the time, we were in those early days, the company didn't have a lot of cash, so we were mostly paid in stock, which, in the long run proved quite fortuitous for a lot of us. But, in real time, it was, got enough of this stock, I could use some cash, so I'm not eating ramen for dinner every night. And my, where Chris Cox and I were living at the time was a co-op. So, we're drinking out of jars and, living 3 to a room. And, so to me, the idea of like $5,000, I'll take that. In retrospect, I think that was a 7-figure mistake on taking the cash over the shares. But to your point, exactly. I mean, Facebook and most companies in the Silicon Valley are very generous with referral bonuses, because that is, everyone in tech recruiting will tell you that's far and away the best way to get people in the door. Partly just for the technicalities of it, like what you're hitting on before. How do you vet people? How, in a sea of applicants, can you possibly figure out, in the course of 6 or 7 hours of interviews, how can you figure out that this person is worth investing in for the long term? Referrals were just the gold standard. And the data within the company proved, in terms of who succeeded, who stuck around, who was the best cultural fit. I mean, referrals just always provided such a strong line of talent. And that's something we've certainly seen in the hospitality world. And I'm sure you've experienced it too, that, people, when you can get people to bring in other people as their coworkers, it definitely gives you a head start, both in terms of having the possibility of friendships within the company and the benefits that come from that, but also the vetting, and you get that dedication to each other, or at least that sense of responsibility to each other. You're not going to have people flake and just not show for shifts if they're working with their friends, because they're not, they may leave some faceless manager hanging. They're not going to leave their friend hanging. Right. So, I think that's one of the things that is universal, that to the extent you can rely on friendship and referral networks, that is far and away the best way to build a talent pipeline.
Yeah, your friends are usually not going to leave you high and dry too many times,
Right.
unless there's a girl or something like that. You know, like, hey man, what the hell happened? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. For the most part, though, you're usually in pretty good shape when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Now for you, not only in your time at Facebook, but just over your career and even going through Stanford and schooling, and what were some of those things that kind of drove you then, continue to drive you now? I mean, where's that drive for you? And I know for a lot of people, some people are extremely driven, totally goal orientated, and for some people, they're driven for a while, and then there's complacency, like all times in life. I think everybody, they see the storybook and it's like this, and that's just how it's supposed to go. But life usually doesn't work out that way. So I'm just curious for you. I mean, where's your drive come from, or what kind of drives you?
I don't. It's funny that I don't entirely know. I've always been one of those people that just kind of keeps going, even if I don't entirely know to what end. One of the things that I marveled at was the people, being around a lot of those crazy motivated people in high school and college and at Facebook. To watch one of the co-founders of Facebook, Dustin Moskovitz, kills himself at Facebook for 4 or 5 years and then leaves and starts Asana and immediately throws himself back. At the point at which he leaves Facebook, the company has made it. If he wants to retire and do nothing, that avenue is entirely open to him. Even if he wants to take it easy, just become an angel investor, which so many people in those early days did, he can take that path where he's keeping himself busy and interested, but isn't having to, kill himself. And instead, he just jumps right back into brand new startup where it's all on his shoulders. And he is, for the next 3 years, heads down, killing himself again to build another successful company. I could never have done that coming out of that. One thing that I think had helped me my whole life was I was always surrounded by people who were smarter, better, faster, stronger. Growing up, I went to a small prep school here in Pasadena. I'm back in Pasadena now. I'm back living about 3 miles from where I grew up, and my kids are very bizarrely now at the same school I went to, which is not something I ever expected to happen in my life. But I went to this small elite prep school where, by the time I graduated, I was maybe in the middle of, I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out I was in the bottom half of my graduating class, and yet still went to Stanford. There were 8 of us, a class of 85. There were 8 of us that went to Stanford, and half the class went to Ivies or sort of Ivy level equivalent schools. So, in high school, I was not the smartest kid, not uniquely talented in any way. It helped me a lot because when I got to Stanford, I was already used to being around the types of students you encounter at Stanford, whereas most kids get to Stanford and for them, it's a culture shock because these are all valedictorian. So many of these kids are valedictorians. If they were the smartest kid at their school, they were the best kid in soccer in their state, all of these things where it's like they were number one, and they get to Stanford that is a field of number ones, and suddenly they have to realize they don't stand out anymore. For me, I was used to it because I had already been surrounded to that. So I get to Stanford, I'm content I'm not going to excel at anything. I'm just going to find my place and go along. And I think that helped me well, kind of like what I talked about at Stanford, when I get to Facebook, I know I'm not the guy who's going to come up with the new algorithm that's going to make the site more efficient. I'm not the brilliant product designer who's going to come up with that next big thing that's going to go viral. Even on the stuff I worked on, I think just I'm sure someone could have done everything I did better than I did. But I think just, trying to be that person who's just always curious, always willing to try things, very humble and very open, just always served me well. I don't for a second pretend like luck isn't the biggest factor in where I've been more than anything. I think there's sort of 2 kinds of successful people. There are the people who are uniquely talented and driven and who very much can take credit for where they are. And those, I think you see that a lot in athletics of, luck has very little to do in most athletic disciplines. maybe in any one competition, but it's hard work and dedication and believing in yourself. But I think for those of us that don't identify as having any unique or exceptional skills, I think it's humility and openness and insatiable curiosity, to just put yourself in position. And, I can't act like I created my own luck, but I guess did the right thing so that when those opportunities arose, I was in the right place at the right time or in the right circumstances that I could make the most of it. How I landed at Facebook was super random and stupid lucky was the year after I graduated Stanford, was working on campus and living in a house with 4 of my friends who either, one was a redshirt senior on the basketball team, had another year left. A couple were doing grad programs at Stanford, and a couple were like me and were working in the area. We had an extra bedroom and advertised around for it. And out of nowhere, Sean Parker moved in with us because he needed somewhere to live at the time. And we didn't have any connection to him. It was, a friend of a friend of a friend saw an email we had sent to some Stanford list looking for a roommate, and he moved in with us. And, a year later,
that's the dude from Napster.
Yeah. I remember my friend who had put out the ad, got this email back of just looked up this guy who just is the only person who responded to our email. And I'm pretty sure this is the co-founder of Napster. And we're why would this guy need to be living with 5 random dudes in a kind of unexciting house? And realize, you don't Napster never made money. So, right. made a name for himself and had no money. But it was that dumb luck that, met Sean Parker through there, lived with him for a year. We all moved out. And 3 months after we moved out, suddenly he was working at Facebook and emailed me, and I happened to be doing nothing at the time. I had applied and was going to go to law school the following year, and basically had what I thought 9 months to kill, and sort of, was about to run out of money and sort of assumed, okay, I'm just gonna have to go live with my parents until law school starts. And out of nowhere, I get an email from Sean Parker. He's like, hey, I'm at Facebook now. You want to come work here? I was like, sure, I got 9 months to kill, might as well. still thinking I was going to go to law school. I'd lived through the first .com crash was while I was a sophomore at Stanford when it really unfolded, and the number of students who had dropped out their sophomore year and gone to startups and for some period of time were worth several $1 million, and suddenly we're now as a 27-year-old junior standing in line with me at the dining hall in the dorm, realizing okay, I've seen this .com story play out before. I'm not going to assume that this is going to be a life-changing experience.
Right.
I was still technically deferring from law school the first 4 years I was working at Facebook. Didn't want to give up that lifeline just in case. Mm-hmm. But, figured, just the dumbest luck that ended up there, the dumbest luck being born where I was born and having the opportunity to go to the prep school I went to, the dumbest luck that I got into Stanford,
right. Cool. I mean, well, some of those things you don't get to choose where you're born, or yeah, you don't get to choose some of those things for sure. And I mean, there's definitely a lot of humility coming through, and you're extremely humble. And one of those things that I can definitely tell, I mean, clearly he had spent the time with you, right? And that opportunity had created itself going through hey, who's somebody I could reach out for looking to hire people? Okay, guys, clearly smart, talented, seems open, curious. I mean, all those things that you touched on. And I think those are extremely valuable qualities that can be really hard to find. I think it's really difficult to find somebody that is willing to be open, and because a lot of people that you meet are very closed off. And I think another one of those big things is a fear of failure. Taking those risks and those opportunities. Well, yay, it's a 9-month flyer, worst comes to worst. But also at that same time, there are, I would say, a much higher percentage. They're like, you know what, I'm good. Look for somebody else. I'm kind of going to go do this because there's that risk. And I think that's one of the biggest things from a lot of the guests that I've had on, and including yourself, is not being afraid to go out and be wrong. Take a risk, or okay, I failed. Okay, back to the drawing board, or whatever else. And I think that is a very, very unique quality, because that's one of those things I continue to seem to find. And I think it happens more and more in our younger generation, or at least it seems that way, especially with the rise of, the interaction with some of those people, and they don't want to be wrong. They don't want to,
Yeah.
I don't want to look like an idiot. So I'm just going to stay here and play pretend in my little box here and not break through and take those chances, which I think, I mean, I think that's extremely unique. And it's definitely, you have to be bold at certain points in your life. And, as you say, you're curious and talented and smart. So when you find that opportunity of like, okay, this seems like a flyer of 9 months. And as you said, you deferred for 4 years. So even if it's not, you still have a little bit of like, okay, like, let's see where this goes. But if not, I'm still going to be okay. I still have something to kind of fall back on.
Yeah. I mean, risk taking is definitely part of it. What's funny with me is so many of the things I have turned out to be good at were things I didn't think were things that would come natural to me. Like I talked about, I was the one running the company all hands meetings and doing those Q of A's. I think of myself as someone who's terrified of public speaking and does not like being the center of attention and being up in front of crowds. And yet there I was every week. And, towards the end of my tenure at Facebook, I'd be there in front of like 1,000 people, like asking the CEO the hardest question I can think of, which, talk to 13-year-old me. That's like the biggest nightmare scenario I could imagine. And I never thought of myself as entrepreneurial, and I ironically still don't think of myself as entrepreneurial. And yet I keep getting into these new business ventures and starting things. So, I think it's a combination of both playing to your own strengths, but, it is being comfortable being uncomfortable. I feel like I'm starting to sound like a Peloton instructor with that, but I think true. That is, I always, I remember like the first time I ever worked with a trainer of any kind, I'd never really worked out serious in my life, and finally, got a trainer. Figured if I spent money on it, that would motivate me to take it seriously. But it was, I think that lesson that started with that, and that was the breakthrough for me, was that idea of knowing physically what it felt like being comfortable, being uncomfortable, and getting past that point where as soon as something hurt, you stopped. And then on the opposite side of pushing through, as soon as something was hard, not giving up. And as soon as you're in an uncomfortable situation, not just shutting down from it. Moving into the hospitality world, one of the really tough things was dealing with turnover and how quickly, you just don't have long runways in that space, as from that space of, you can't go months and months and months not succeeding. Those businesses really, every week you got to be on point, which means you sometimes have to make fast changes, whether it's personnel or branding or other decisions, and making those kind of quick, harsh decisions doesn't feel like something that comes natural to me. I usually want to let things evolve and stew over them and be very thoughtful about them, and being in an environment where it's like, no, you got to pull the trigger. If someone's not working out, make the change. If something's not selling, yank it. Doesn't matter how good the idea sounds on paper. If it's not working, own up to that really fast and move on. And that's not something that feels like it comes natural to me, but it's something I have found myself to be good at in a way that surprises me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's certainly critical, having to be able to kind of pivot on a dime of whether it's working or kind of it's not. And I think, clearly you learned that through years at it's interesting how that shapes you over the course of your life, and you kind of take and pick and choose. And, one of the things, one of the books I'm reading right now is Ray Kroc, Grinding It Out. And that's been a super, I saw the movie, I saw The Founder, but, the book, you just get so many different layers. And, at 52 or 53 to kind of go off and dive in this whole new venture. And it was earlier today, I was reading him how he talked about the French fries. And he was just, there's this certain way and this whole process. I was like, my God, this guy is really dedicated to having the perfect French fry, not only for just his, I guess it's the first franchisee he had in Illinois, but every single one that went after that, this is how it's got to go. And, what differentiates which, obviously McDonald's is McDonald's for that reason, but just super amazing to kind of hear the value in them having to pivot, having to make those decisions of, the ice cream's not working this way, and now we're going to go with the powder because it's going to be more cost effective and in the long term. And it's interesting to kind of see how those changes happen so quickly. And now, I mean, with the ever growing world of everyone being connected online, I feel like you don't have that opportunity to like, hey, let's phase this out for 6 months or let's roll this out for 6 months and kind of see what the feedback is, what this looks like. I mean, it's kind of that sharp, nope, we got to pull it. We got to make that tough decision.
There were, it was actually, it was funny that two of the early guiding mottos at Facebook that you'd see it plastered on the walls ever, Facebook, actually, all of the offices have these sort of, I don't know what the right word is, but I'll call them like propaganda posters, these very, very well designed posters all over the place. But two of the ones that were kind of the most kind of core to the company that would get repeated a lot were done is better than perfect and move fast and break things, which was sort of a notorious company motto in the early days. And it entirely hit on that, which was get things out, get things done. Don't worry about every little thing being right. Part of me of my specific roles at Facebook, those two things made my life harder than almost any other things that the company believed in. I'm the guy who's trying to make sure everyone in the company knows what's going on. So the idea of just being done and launching things, the days I would be getting yelled at by one part of the company because of feature launch that no one had any idea was coming. And, I'm trying to make sure everyone's on the same page. And before that, when I was a product manager, bugs on the site or features that didn't work right was like my nightmare. But like I wanted everything to be functional and every edge case to be covered. And meanwhile, the ethos of the company is just launch it. We'll fix it. We'll fix it on the website rather than, we do not do back then we did not do long beta periods. It was, we tested something out by launching it and seeing what happened. And there's certainly limits to that of the face, I think as Facebook matured, I remember there was a little bit of a attempt at nuance around the move fast and break things motto. There are certain types of features that perfect is more important than done, especially as Facebook moved into payments and getting into financial transactions, those need to work right. You can't really rush those types of things. But still, that sort of idea of encouraging risk-taking, encouraging people just to keep moving, keep trying things. It is something in the hospitality world we've tried. And one of the cultural things that was successful was trying to give every employee some latitude to at least offer ideas, if not to actually try some things their own way. In the food service world, that's difficult, especially in the kitchen, they operate very militaristically of, line cooks do not have leeway to do anything. It's like, you will use exactly 2 ounces of meat, exactly like 1 gram of this, 2 grams of that, like one bay leaf, one sprig of parsley will be exactly in this location. But outside of that, we would always try to find, with housekeepers, for example, they're not used to anyone ever asking them, how could you be doing your job better? They're just used to people telling them exactly what to do and yelling at them when they don't do it exactly the way they were told. We found some success with what would make you, what would help you do this faster? What would make you happier? What tools can we give you that we're not giving you? And it's amazing that when you ask those kinds of questions, what you get back from people and that level of engagement. And those are the kinds of things that can get people to start to care.
Certainly,
if you make it, essentially you ask someone for their idea and you try it out, it's on them whether it works or not at that point. Nothing will motivate someone to do a good job to know that, man, if this doesn't work, it's on me. Or on the flip side, if this does work, I'm going to get credit for it.
Well, it also starts to give them ownership, right? It starts to give them like, hey, this is, obviously we're taking your advice, we're taking your feedback, and we're going to make some changes, or we're going to give it a shot. Yeah.
I think one, and it kind of hits on one other thing. Facebook was good at identifying pretty early on, and Mark, would say, and for a while it wasn't clear if he meant it, but over time he did, which was, we would view it as a success if somebody essentially outgrew their role at Facebook and would leave. You know, if someone left to go start their own thing, that was viewed as a success story. The idea that Facebook wasn't necessarily somewhere anyone was going to spend their entire career, but if Facebook helped elevate them to the next level, that was still a success story for the company, even if that person left. And that was something I really hoped we could infuse into our hospitality projects, where there are very few people that work at a restaurant or a hotel who intend for this to be their long-term career. You know, most people front of house at restaurants, at least half the people, will own up to, I'm only here to earn money for X, Y, or Z. I'm saving for this, or I'm in school, or I'm trying to make it, here in LA, I'm trying to make it in Hollywood. It's amazing, that trope, how true it is, like how many people that work in hospitality really are trying to make it in Hollywood here in LA. But even in those cases, the idea that this job will do something for you, beyond just the paycheck, that if we can make it feel like, if you are interested in hospitality, you will learn skills here that, if you make a horizontal move, if you leave us to take the same job somewhere else, that sucks. If you leave us because you got offered a management position somewhere else, we need to view that as a success. That if somebody can get a vertical promotion elsewhere that we couldn't provide them ourselves, that's still a success story. And that kind of care and concern for the development of your employees will become obvious to everyone, as opposed to feeling like an environment where either you're a disposable cog or we're just going to work you for everything you're good for and keep you motivated enough to keep you here, but our goal is to squeeze you for everything you're worth.
Yeah.
To the extent you can create that sense of all of us are trying to get somewhere better than this or somewhere bigger than this, let's all work together to support each other in that. And, whatever form of professional development it takes, whether it's just one-on-one mentoring, whether it's just openly talking about that. I mean, what's funny is how few jobs openly talk about encouraging their employees to outgrow their current job, even if that means outgrowing the company. But that still just creates a sense of care and concern that if you feel like the company cares about you, that has to be an ingredient that helps you care about the company back. And even after you're gone, to be an advocate, one of the biggest things for Facebook that I think saved it through many of its early firestorms was that even its ex-employees were loyal and would be out there defending the company and speaking out on its behalf, even at that point when they didn't really have anything to gain from it, and
Right.
certainly had nothing on the line for it. Even the hospitality environment, it's a small world, especially in an environment like, in Park City, if you're running a restaurant and, there's a boss who's a jerk to everyone, that's going to get around and that company is going to have trouble hiring people. Whereas if you hear about, this company has this motivational boss, and yeah, their turnover is the same as others, but everybody who leaves on good terms and goes to something that was sort of the next step of where they wanted to go, as opposed to just going somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good sign that you've got something good going.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think allowing people, because at least I hope that most people would want to aspire to more, not just, you would hope that the cleaning lady wouldn't just aspire to be the cleaning lady or whatever role that you're at in Facebook. Like, you want to move on and grow and continue to kind of challenge yourself and set new goals and not just, stagnate.
Right.
So I think
and even if that goal, it's funny, like I mentioned, half the people working in our restaurants
mm-hmm.
are not there. This is not a part of it. This is not a career. This is a gig. Even then, what can you offer them beyond just the paycheck that will motivate them to give you more while they're there, even if it's in service of something that has nothing to do with your day-to-day business.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's just flexibility, that alone, just supporting, knowing that whatever else they're doing may have odd hours or may require them to to need random times off,
Yeah, no,
or it's figuring out what is it that they want to do and what is it about the current role that could help them with that, or even just giving them opportunities to learn separate from that. If we have wait staff who want to learn about the accounting side of, how does the accounting here work, just because they're interested in that, give them the opportunity to peek into that. Give people management opportunities that you might not be inclined to otherwise, or give people responsibility, let them take a crack at something, even if it seems like it might be a stretch for them. Give them that chance, just to see.
No, absolutely. Now for you, now, or even your time during Facebook, I mean, what were some of those things that would help? I mean, how would you be able to stay focused? You say you get your hands everywhere, and even with Arrive and the entrepreneur business there, you got the hotels, you got the restaurants, you're kind of piecing everything together. How are you managing your time? Because that is one of those things that I'm always super curious about, because I tried my best in managing my time and not letting the day slip away. So it's one of those things that I'm just super fascinated with, because there's always so many different answers. I have some people that come on, like, I got my calendar booked out for like 6 months, and then each day, maybe I'll tinker. I got some people that'll be like, nope, I wake up, this is what my day looks like. Some people are a week, some people. So I'm just super curious for you. I mean, how are you able to kind of stay focused on some of those daily priorities and have everything kind of tasked out?
I think for me, where I am, I mean, I definitely have flirted many times in the last several years with spreading myself too thin.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a lesson I have to keep telling myself over and over, which is, you can either do a lot of things and not be very involved with them, and then they won't feel like you're yours, and you can do that, but or you have to limit yourself and don't overstretch yourself, don't overcommit. And it is very easy when, especially, it's one of those weird things of, for me, my life having been completely transformed by Facebook, it's very easy, and every day I have the opportunity, I have new business ventures cross my plate, and there's always things that sound like great ideas or sound like really interesting things or really fun. And it's part of it is just the discipline of really owning up to one's limits. It's also being very honest about what do you want. And I've gone back and forth over the last few years of recognizing different levels of motivation I've had, and respecting that, if I sense, and it is, it's one of the privileges and luxuries one has when one is in a comfortable place in life, like Facebook has enabled me to be, it is more up to me than almost anyone else. How much do I want to work? Because I know that's not an option most people have. But still kind of being very self-aware of where one is, and not setting oneself up to fail. For me, I think there's an extra motivation, which is so much of what I do touches on other people's livelihoods, that I think I constantly have to remind myself, even if my life doesn't depend on this, how many other people are in fact very dependent on this. I mean, I look now at all of the businesses I've invested in or helped start, and there's probably a couple thousand employees that I feel partially or wholly responsible for. I have to take that seriously. And anytime I'm starting to feel demotivated or want to just walk away, that's something I have to keep in mind is, this hurts other people if you do this, or if you stop paying attention to this, or if you drag on this or deprioritize this. So I think being very sensitive to both putting myself in that position and really only doing so thoughtfully, and then really owning up to that responsibility, that even if I'm not dependent on this, if I've created dependencies on others to be, I'm even more responsible, given how privileged and secure my standing is. It's even more on me to make sure that the people dependent on me are taken care of, and are not hung out to dry because I had a lazy week, or wasn't feeling motivated, or didn't feel like I had to. I think that's one of the It's one of the uglier things I've seen in some who've been in my situation is they just start things because they think they're cool and don't see them through and don't really think about the effect that has. Take the fire festival being like the best example of that, of like someone has a cool idea and pushes it along and then it just doesn't kind of work and they just kind of throw their hands up and walk, and how many people get hurt in that situation. That to really take responsibility for those around you, and that the more you have, the more responsible you are for others, and for controlling the things you can control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's definitely a lot of responsibility and a lot of, you talk about thousands of people there. It's like when I had David Perkins on, who, founder of High West, that was one of the big things he touched on as he was kind of moving on and figuring out what was going to happen with High West. You have Constellation to come in, and we're the people that helped build up that company, where they're going to be put in a good spot for a bright future, and where they're going to be, taken care of. And it's one of those things where not only about you have to be aware, or at least, you want to be aware, and you want those people to not end up in a poor situation.
Yeah, definitely. And what's funny is actually the flip side, which was, a lot of times founders having such strong attachments to their baby that they don't want to sell in a situation like that, even if it's a sale is going to create a windfall for all these people, but it's not something you personally want to do because you don't want to give up your thing. You can run into that situation where as much as making sure the decisions you make, everyone's taken care of, you also have to think about the decisions you don't take. Are you taking care of people with those decisions as well? And it is weird that shit, you do hit some inflection point where anytime you're an entrepreneur, when you succeed, it creates this funny situation that you have to click in your brain that it's not just about you and your vision. At some point, it becomes about something bigger, and you have to be empathetic to those who have come along on the ride with you, and you cannot sacrifice them for your own journey. Or if you do, you need to be very well aware of that you're making that call and very conscientious of it.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, can definitely be difficult, especially I'm sure at the moment when you're trying to decipher through those decisions, that's one of those things that for a lot of people can get swept under the rug, or kind of people can lose sight on. Now, in going through for you, I know you touched on your parents and how the drive and hard work of both of them. I mean, who are some of those people that kind of helped propel some of the drive? And for you, I mean, would it be mom and dad, or are there others there that you kind of look at? And was it the environment in Facebook and those other people not wanting to let your friends down and reaching those deadlines and everything else? I'm just kind of curious there.
I've somehow always been around very motivated people. And it's funny because I've never viewed myself as a motivated person. And yet I look back and it's like, I seem to have achieved quite a bit for somebody who doesn't feel like they were ever particularly motivated. But I think it's, I think it's just being in a community where expectations get set, or just you're seeing the examples all the time. It's one thing, it's funny, my wife and I debating, where we were going to send our kids to school, and that they did end up at a private school like I went through, as opposed, and debated a lot of, is that right? Or should our kids not be given sort of that privilege just because we have the means for it? What would be best for them? And if I look back at what was it about the school that had the most value, clearly, the resources that school has are obviously very elevated, and there's so much privilege wrapped up in those resources. But interestingly, I think what makes schools like that really stand out is actually the community of parents and the expectations and motivations that communally get set from having a lot of people who expect a lot of all of the students, and that rubs off on you. That's not just your own parents. When you go to your friends' parents' houses, you're picking up on that same level of expectations, that everyone expects you to do these things and achieve a lot. And you just kind of see, you see that I get to Stanford, and there it's like the stakes are even higher, where now you're not just expected to succeed academically, you're expected to change the world. And, just being constantly surrounded by people achieving great things in a place like Stanford, it's insane where it's, I'm surrounded by Olympians and, just looking at my freshman dorm, I still have a really strong group of friends that I met my freshman year, but looking at the other kids in our dorm, we had the NCAA women's singles champion lived on my hallway. I got to drink out of the NCAA trophy when she came home with the cup, and we all got to pass it around and drink beer out of it. And there's like top level scientists, there's politicians now, just to be in those environment around those people. And I think just putting yourself in that situation where you just see people around you achieving a lot, it just instinctively rubs off on you that the people who achieve a lot aren't, yes, that there's unique attributes to them and they are unique people who stand out in different ways, but they're also just kind of ordinary people at the end of the day, and they can come from anywhere. And realizing how much of motivation is really just something anyone can create in any environment can be created really registers with me that, why a big reason why private schools or charter schools or other mission-minded schools are more successful isn't necessarily just the resources. It's also just the community of expectations that gets created, that everyone in that environment is expected to do something. You're not just there. It's not just that you're taking harder courses and you're expected to do well at them. You're expected to do something great with that afterwards, and sense of responsibilities is in college, even working at Facebook, both within the company of people striving to do something and then people leaving the company to go do amazing things out on the side. If I had wanted to just rest on my laurels and do nothing for the rest of my life, I could have. I mean, that's the crazy thing about the amazing blessings I've gotten from having randomly landed at Facebook when I did, and there's a couple of people I worked with who have taken that road and have done absolutely nothing with their life, of certainly nothing that impacted anyone outside of themselves or their immediate circle of friends, and I just didn't want to turn into that and didn't want to go down that road. So, I don't know I think I've just always been surrounded by, I don't remember my parents ever putting pressure on me to do something, but simply by virtue of their example of, my mom founded and directed this preschool forever. My dad was, working on satellites that were going to other planets and studying the oceans around us. And, it's just seeing these examples is enough to make one think, anyone can have a life of impact. It really just is about trying more than anything and keeping at it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one, it's I was thinking about it on the negative aspect. It's the motto, guilty by association, right? Or one of, I mean, I know that they say I think you're motivated by most likely to be like the 7 people or 8 people that you spend the most time around. So, that, I mean, that kind of speaks to that environment, and, constantly being around that seems to lend itself where success is kind of going to happen when everyone around you is kind of like, hey, we need to do this. Like, we don't need to be fucking around, like getting in trouble and making big mistakes and things of that nature. And I was always one thing I remember my parents, surround yourself with a good group of friends, don't surround yourself with some poor character choices and things of that nature, And
it's amazing in most fields. I mean, Facebook in the tech world, obviously there are technical levels of expertise one must have to succeed. In most aspects of business, you don't really need any technical aspects. I look at my wife's extended family, and so many of her relatives, very few of them went to college, and so many of them are just crushing it in different businesses, be it, real estate development. One of her cousins started a hardwood flooring business and just drove and just found this niche and just nailed it, and has built an incredibly successful company out of nowhere. He's not someone that ever thought about construction or cared about hardwood flooring. I still don't think he actually cares about hardwood flooring, but just, found a niche and just, went for it. And I don't do a lot of motivation, what I would call motivational speaking, but occasionally when I'm talking to groups who are in environments that were sort of very different than mine growing up, I always try to make the point to them, which is, you look around the world of hospitality, it is 95% of success is motivation. There's not a lot of background one has to have. There's not a lot one can learn about the business from the outside. It is not, hospitality is not an academic venture at all. It is very much roll up your sleeves and do the work. And it is work anybody can do. Mm-hmm. So really just making people realize how much of success is just really about self-discipline and hustle, and how far that can get you in so many different fields, anything sales related. A couple of my friends who are very much salespeople at heart, how successful they are just solely based on personality traits and doing, putting themselves out there in uncomfortable situations and, taking those chances of just talking to people and making a pitch that sounds impossible and yet somehow works out. That's something anybody can do if they set themselves to it. Certainly, I don't want to gloss over and make it sound that easy that, there are clearly so many circumstances that hold people back and structures that are sort of just unfairly stacked against certain individuals or groups of individuals. But it very much is true that there is so much success to be had in the business world that can come from effort alone. Mm-hmm. And the self-motivation is one of the most important skills one can have, of just taking a chance, learning, putting oneself out there, like how much that turns out to be part of the formula for success for so many people.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one thing to kind of finish up here that I wanted to ask you for those listening that maybe are piggybacking. We've talked about the effort and touched on some of those things, but if you had like one piece of advice, if they're going in, they're doing their startup, or they're starting out in their business, and they're kind of navigating the doubts and fears on what's the right move, what's the right call, what would kind of be one piece of advice for some of those people out there?
I think one key piece of advice is that, don't be, I think it is that sense of humility that recognize what it is that is working and what isn't, and don't be so attached to don't think you're so right that your idea is infallible, and recognize how much more of the success is coming from your sweat and your effort than the idea itself. That means if you, be ready to pivot, be ready to make modifications. There's always these stories that come out of the Silicon Valley of companies that ended up succeeding at something wildly different than what they started with. Lyft is a funny example of that. I met the founder of Lyft early on when it was meant to be sort of this carpooling app called Zimride, and Lyft was sort of a side project of that they, just kind of launched on a whim one day and very quickly took over the carpooling app and became the thing. And there's so many examples of that where even if the change isn't that dramatic, you're not completely changing your business model, there's still subtle changes that make all the difference. And so I think recognizing that humility to not always know why something is successful or why you yourself are successful, and just knowing it's all about plugging away in the effort and the dedication, so that you don't get too hung up on thinking we succeeded because I'm smart, or we succeeded because this was a great idea, as opposed to we succeeded because we kept trying really hard and we pivoted and we failed and learned from the failure and tried again. That's just so much more important than relying on one great idea or just one person's expertise and thinking that alone is what's going to get you there. One of my friends from Stanford started a toy company a few years ago, and this company has kept plodding along. Is always kind of teetering on success. It's never quite hit that level being fully self-sustaining, but always feels on the cusp of it. And the idea that they're now working on is so far away from, originally it was about engineering toys for young girls. And now it's becoming about content creation on YouTube for all these different types of characters. And having watched the evolution from point A to point B, one reason this company has survived and continues to feel like it's on the cusp of success is their willingness to pivot, and to not have been so hung up of it was the idea was always the thing. It wasn't. It was the idea, the original idea lit up the next step you were going to take, and that lit up the next step. And sometimes the next step that gets lit up is behind you. Sometimes it's way over here. If you're lucky, it's in front of you, and you've hit on that path that you can finally walk in a straight line for a while. But that's the exception. I mean, most times when you're entrepreneurial, it's the next right step is not right in front of you. It's and realizing sometimes, taking steps back is not necessarily a wrong thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's something, backwoods skiing, sometimes you start going down a path, and sometimes the right thing is, take off the skis, walk back up a little bit. Like this canyon is not going to end, let's go find another trail here that's going to get us back to where we're supposed to be. I think that's a big thing that often gets lost when people are trying to inspire entrepreneurs, where it's always just, believe in yourself relentlessly, or relentlessly pursue your one idea. Relentlessness is definitely part of it, but it's not being so dedicated to just that first idea or just one thing, and really being open to the idea that what works is different than what you thought was going to work. And your idea may not be the best one, but always be ready to adopt whatever now seems like the best idea, even if it's not yours.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. Yeah. Wise words. I'm going to keep right. I've got my notes here. So thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time. I really do appreciate it. This has been an absolute blast. I've learned a ton. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you're watching or listening on YouTube, please make sure you hit that bell button so you get notified every time a new episode drops. Thanks.